You're listening to the Voice of Russia in London. I'm James Reinl, and we're taking a look at the ongoing bloodshed in Syria. After almost 16 months of increasingly violent opposition to President Bashar al-Assad, and the Syria crisis becomes ever more worrying. Events in recent days suggest the tensions there are developing an increasingly sectarian dimension. Reports suggest Sunni Muslims are travelling from Tunisia, Algeria and Kosovo to join their brethren in Syria. An obscure Islamist group, Jabhat al-Nusra li-Ahli al-Sham, claims responsibility for massive suicide bombings in Damascus, prompting fears of al-Qaeda involvement. Sectarian clashes between Sunnis and Alawites, the president's powerful minority clan, are spilling across the border into Lebanon. What initially looked like a secular movement against Assad's rule could be evolving into a region-wide jihad between rival religious factions. Meanwhile, Assad shows no sign of backing down, and the opposition Syrian National Council remains deeply divided. So, is Syria in danger of becoming like Iraq in the dark days of the al-Qaeda insurgency? Is there any hope left in the peace plan and monitoring of the international envoy Kofi Annan? And does the argument for foreign intervention get stronger as the bloodshed gets worse? To probe these questions, we're hosting a discussion in our London studio. I'm joined by Yossi from the think tank Chatham House and Regent's College, James Denslow, a blogger and commentator on the Middle East, Abdul Wahab Omar, the Syrian opposition activist, and Victor Mizin from the Moscow State Institute of International Relations over the line from Russia. Okay, to get the ball rolling, I'd like to get a single sentence answer from each of you to the following question. First of all, to you, Yossi, is the Syria crisis evolving from a political to a sectarian conflict?
In a single sentence, I think from the beginning there was an element of sectarianism in this conflict. It just got worse because it couldn't achieve any positive result.
Okay, and James?
I think there's increasingly sectarian elements to it, but I would still describe it as an opposition to the regime that's very diverse in its makeup.
Okay, and Abdul Wahab Omar?
I believe there are two sects in this conflict. The one is the sect that has a degree of conscience. On the other side, the sect that has lost all conscience whatsoever. Yet the regime is playing along those religious lines.
And Victor, over the line to Russia.
Yes, I think it's quite the case, and contrary to what many Russian conspiracy theorists are thinking, that United States had instigated Arab Spring. I think that it was completely unexpected process, and now it only enhances the positions, the foothold of all extremists, marginals and terrorists like al-Qaeda. But unfortunately, I think that Assad regime is doomed, because I am probably naive messianic thinker, but I think that democracy will sooner or later prevail worldwide.
Maybe I'll turn back to you, Yossi, at this stage. You said that it was sectarian to begin with and that it's getting worse. Can you maybe present an analysis of what we've seen over the last few days? For example, the bomb attacks in Damascus that left 55 people dead and almost 400 wounded. Is there any link in your mind between what happened there and al-Qaeda?
I think there might be, and al-Qaeda is kind of an abstract an amorphic definition. It's not an organization with a chain of command. Just if you look at the letters allegedly were left by bin Laden, it's more an ideas and more way to operate than in a chain of command that tells certain people what to do and what not to do. But the sectarianism started in the sense that the opposition was always been divided there. There was no sort of ideology or ideas how to get what. The only thing, as James said earlier, is getting rid of Assad, the president, and the regime for 40 years. Taking it from there, as a result of the lack of any solution, the lack of involvement from the international community in a positive way, it opened the way, in a way that Iraq opened the way to all sort of little group, bigger group, to do whatever they do, including the Islamists that are thriving on creating havoc. In the idea that if the worse it becomes, the better it's for them, because they will have more influence when the Assad regime eventually is removed.
And carrying on there, what do you think about reports of Libyan and Tunisian fighters turning up and dying in Syria, and also this suggestion from Russia that Kosovo is becoming some kind of training camp for rebels?
It's always a possibility. There is a lot of, in this kind of situation, we get a lot of information, and I think it has to be monitored and checked whether this is actually the situation. But as was the case in Iraq and in other places, as was the case in Bosnia, it would attract this kind of Islamist, other groups that come to support their brethren. Weapons will be supplied because they are available. And Syria, unfortunately, can become one of these breeding grounds to extremism. And the end result of it might be that these kind of groups will take eventually role in Syria, which was not the case at the beginning of this uprising.
James, turning to you there, following on from what Yossi is saying, do you have any fears or concerns that Syria could be descending into an Iraq-style insurgency?
Well, we're a long way away from the situation in Iraq. Iraq suffers from an endemic problem of terrorism, car bombs, suicide bombs on a weekly basis. We simply don't report it anymore because it's so common. Seeing a similar thing in Damascus, of course, is big news, and I think a big event, a big signpost towards what could potentially be the situation there in future. Bear in mind, the conflict has only been going on for just over a year. That said, there have been suicide attacks, there have been car bombings in Damascus and in Syria before. There was the group Jund al-Sham that was blamed on a lot of terrorist attacks prior to the uprising. The very building that was attacked last week has been attacked in 2008 before. So there is a bit of blowback here as well. I think we should look at Syria's role with acquiescing to jihadists travelling into Iraq. It's interesting that on the jihadist websites, the al-Qaeda in Iraq grouping is urging its followers to flow back into Syria. There's rumours that the head of al-Qaeda in Iraq came in across from Turkey last week. I think the Americans pick up a lot of chatter. They put a lot of investment in monitoring this, and they're saying that they don't believe this is a regime attacking itself, but rather this is the act of an al-Qaeda-esque group. And I think for them to say that proves that there is a degree of intelligence to prove that. However, that doesn't mean they have a structural organisation that can run a serious counter-insurgency in the country. Al-Qaeda is a franchise, as Yossi mentioned, that thrives in non-state contested zones, in chaotic environments. And the opposition in Syria is huge and multifaceted and diverse, a product of the fact that Assad dominated the oxygen of the country politically for decades, and it's very understandable for the opposition to be diverse. However, I think we should hold back from saying that we're in full-scale Iraq-style scenario right yet.
Maybe I'll turn to you at that stage, Abdul Wahab Omar. Do you have any concerns that what started out as a pro-democracy secular movement is being mixed up with these other elements?
Well, we have to realize that opportunists will always try to find fertile ground to spread their own propaganda and their own ideologies. Syria is no exception. Al-Qaeda, let's not forget, let's not blow things out of proportion, Al-Qaeda is present in most countries. Al-Qaeda is present here in the UK. Al-Qaeda is present in the United States of America. So, of course, there will be a presence in Syria as well, as it's a lot easier for the groups to be disguised. But let's not blow this thing out of proportion. We have a serious problem of reporting and finding out who is behind everything. We are all talking about this terrorist attack. Even this morning, we've got the news. BBC and the terrorist monitoring website site is actually reporting that Al-Nusra Front has made a public statement saying that it was not behind the suicide bombing attacks that happened in Damascus. And as the opposition has widely claimed, it is a different part of this equation. And who we claim to continue say, it is the Syrian regime. You don't have to look very far. We've got a regime that has been accused before. It has been accused by al-Maliki government for creating these terrorist groups and exporting them into Iraq, similarly within the Lebanese grounds. And we've got the slogans and the clues everywhere. Whenever a city, a school, a town, a village, a house is raided by Assad's thugs, they clearly spell it out on the walls by saying it's either Assad or we burn the country down. And if you want a more official statement, let's ask the Grand Mufti of Syria, who is directly appointed by the president, Mufti Hassoun, who made it very public in a sermon a few months back, saying Syria has the ability that if it gets threatened to mobilize jihadi suicide bombers any place, any time. You could not get a more official statement than the religious authority of Syria defending the regime by claiming that they can mobilize suicide bombers. Why are we surprised that we are seeing them targeting inside Damascus when the only people that can benefit from such attacks are the regime itself?
Maybe I'll let you get in there, Victor. I just want to throw something in, which is a comment from Russia's Deputy Foreign Minister, Gennady Gatilov. Now, he has, on the record, blamed last week's deadly Damascus bombings on Islamist extremists. extremist. He said, "For us, it is absolutely clear that terrorist groups are behind this, al-Qaeda and those groups that work with al-Qaeda." Another side of this is that Russia's UN ambassador Vitaly Churkin has warned the UN Security Council that Kosovo could be becoming a training center for rebels. What's your analysis of it?
For Russia, even that some foreign policy guru has stated that we won't give you Syria, and it's quite understandable. Syria becoming the last stepping point of Russia in the entire Middle East and the only naval actually base in the region. But I think the underpinnings of the Russian positions are more philosophical. Russia, which is probably one of the last opponents of Westphalian system, is pretty much against any interventions under any pretext, be it humanitarian or responsibility to protect, and for the probably bearing in mind that it could be done against Russia, but of course it's unthinkable Russia still being a nuclear weapon state. But in Syria, it's a testing ground. Some people thought that Moscow had made some mistakes in Libya, having consented to certain United Nations Security Council resolutions, which in Moscow's view have been distorted by NATO, namely by France and Britain, and Russia is all against that. It could be repeated in this region. But many people who work for me, for example, they recently travel to Damascus and they're telling stories, how calm the life is in the capital. So personally, I would think that, understanding what kind of regime you had, probably it could be possible that in the ex-KGB manner, the regime itself could stage this kind of terrible terrorist assault. And once again, there are two schools. One school is saying that Assad still having this support inside, first of all, Alawite community and many others could remain in power. But still, I think that with all this international pressure and with all this bloodshed and some hundreds of lives who perished in this terrible civil war, I think that his days are counted. And once again, it would be probably one irritating factor, generally speaking, in overall Russian relationship with the West, when Moscow and the West espouses completely different opposing approaches to the problem.
Given that your opinion isn't necessarily one of the mainstream that you find in Russia, do you support Moscow's decision to continue selling weapons to the Assad regime?
Once again, I said that this remaining the last friend, so to say, or even ally, although Mr. Lavrov claimed that Assad is not an ally and that what Russia is doing just trying to avoid becoming bloodshed or Sectarian war. But I think, of course, selling armaments, and we know how many ships have been intercepted in the Mediterranean for that matter. I don't think that it's very wise policy, although, of course, Moscow now is doing everything on the one hand to support the international efforts like the mission of Kofi Annan, on the other hand to tell Assad that Moscow and probably Beijing are still on his side. And I don't think it's very wise politics, because it more and more looks like Russia is supporting all oppressive regimes in the Arab world. It doesn't mean that the so-called, and it probably will be the same case in Syria, that all Arab Spring revolutions are bringing some benign forces. It could be some very nasty pro-Islamist or even marginal forces, but I believe in the wisdom of Arab people, and I think sooner or later we shall overcome. And of course, it's completely against the interests, for example, of Russia or the United States, that all those authoritarian but very, modernization propitious regimes have been supplanted by some very not quite well understood forces ranging from Tunisia to the military in Egypt. And of course, we see this turmoil in Libya. And of course, the prediction could be that if the regime is toppled, it could result in a terrible civil war, sectarian infighting in Syria as well. But still, I think that it's how the democracy or democratization process is coming even to this part of the world, which many experts thought is ossified and would sleep at least for many decades.
James Denslow.
Yeah, I just want to quickly go back to this bombing and the whodunit aspect of things, because what I find quite interesting, especially comparing it with what happened in Iraq, is that sectarian car bombings and suicide car bombings in Iraq tended to target areas in which there was a large concentration of one sect or another. Now, in this particular bombing, we have a smaller bomb that goes off against a security building that takes down a part of that building's wall. Then you have a second bomb that comes a few minutes later and targets the crowd that have gathered around the first bombing, which is another classic al-Qaeda tactic to kill as many civilians as possible. So does this mean the attack was against the security building or was looking to kill as many civilians as possible? And I think that's a very important distinction, because of course any group is trying to say, well, am I trying to sow chaos, or am I trying to kill citizens of all sectarian denominations for another reason? I think that's something worth looking at.
You're listening to the Voice of Russia in London. I'm James Reinl, and we're taking a look at the ongoing bloodshed in Syria. I'm joined by Yossi from the think tank Chatham House and Regent's College, James Denslow, a blogger and commentator on the Middle East, Abdul Wahab Omar, the Syrian opposition activist, and Victor Mizin from the Moscow State Institute of International Relations. Yossi, I'd like to turn to you now and move the conversation on. We've had the arrival late in April of the first unarmed UN observers under the peace plan devised by the international envoy Kofi Annan. That was going to be the start of a group of 300 that is to be deployed in full by the end of May. But of course, we're still seeing violence. We're still seeing worse violence. Is there any reason to think there's any hope left in this peace plan?
I don't think so. What do they observe? They observe more killing. There are 189 of them right now. There will be 300 at most there. If they don't have an authority, they don't have any mandate from the United Nations to do something beyond it, and 300, of course, can't do that. What the policies are going to lead to? The reality is there are between 11 to 12,000 people killed already in the last 14 months, since March last year. The international community is confused. In many ways, the al-Qaeda, whether it's called al-Qaeda bomb or it's the regime, diverts from the main issue. What is the next step needs to be done with Syria? How this regime should probably come to an end and replace with something which serves the Syrian people. And this debate, it's as long as there is no violence, or the violence is the same level, similarly to Iraq, we almost ignore what happened in Syria. We are actually attracted by other international issues, and the attention span of the international community is very short. If the Annan plan is about to reform the Assad regime, I don't believe this regime can be reformed. Is it about bringing more human rights to Syria? I think it's almost laughable. Read Human Rights Watch reports, Amnesty report. How this is going to happen? You need a mandate which is actually powerful, which is something that empower the people that oppose Assad. I don't see this happening, and as a result of this, probably it continues more bloodshed, which unfortunately attract all sorts of unsavory groups into this conflict, because that's exactly what they are looking for.
Abdul Wahab Omar, over the line from Birmingham in the UK. Do you agree with what Yossi says about the Annan plan? It's potentially doomed. And what do you advocate for?
Let's take the individual points. Number one, we said potentially sending 300 observers into the country. Now, if we draw a parallel, we mentioned the Kosovo example earlier. In Kosovo, back in the late 80s, we sent 2,000 observers in a country of 2 million people. Syria is a country of 22 or 23 million people. So I struggle to understand how the mathematics was done over there, and how can 300 observers potentially do anything other than become first-class spectators in a death show. Secondly, we heard General Mood say a few days ago that the success of this plan depends highly on the goodwill of the regime. That is a laughable statement. What goodwill do we expect from a regime that has so far killed so many thousands of people and continues to do on a daily basis? These observers are becoming mere spectators. What Syria needs is peace enforcers and not peace observers, because there is no peace to actually observe happening right now. This plan, sadly, is bound to face the same fate as that of the Arab League. It's just the case that the international community is using it as an excuse to prolong what is happening, because they do not have the will right now to up the ante to the next level, which is actually face Assad with the only language that he understands. The only language that he understands so far, and he has put upon his people, is the language of force. The international community right now does not have the appetite. They're trying to buy time. They're hoping that this will drive, but everybody knows that what we've got so far is nothing but a failure. We are forgetting that the peace plan has got many other points which are all being ignored. Number one, talking about allowing free access to journalists, We already have reports that the regime was holding international journalists in captivity and torturing them for interrogation. We are expecting to have the release of the detainees. We are only seeing more and more arrests taking place, and the situation is getting worse by the day.
Can I stick with you for a moment, Abdul Wahab Omar? I want to ask you another question, which is, what is the alternative? I'm wondering what your relationship is with the Syrian National Council and your observations on what is quite a fractured association of very many different groups that I noticed this week are not going to be taking part in an Arab League meeting in Cairo. Can you give me your analysis of what's happening there?
The international community keeps on using this phrase of division. The entire spectrum of the opposition is united in one aspect, and that is the toppling of the Assad regime. In any revolution in history throughout the world, there always tends to be one tactic. They don't sit and agree on their ideologies, who are the leftists, who are the right wing, who are in the middle. Nobody cares about that. The international community is trying to expose these differences and try to create more division. These people, the vast majority of them, only till about a year and a half ago, were professionals in their own field. Burhan Ghalioun was an academic. Other members were doctors, journalists, etc. Somehow now, because there has been a need, they've been put on the limelight, and everybody expects them to all sing on the same tune. How can we expect that? We've got professional politicians here in this country and in the international community. In fact, we cannot get 15 members of the Security Council to agree on a single resolution, yet we expect the hundreds of members of the opposition in Syria to all agree on an entire future for the country with its constitution and every single detail. Of course there are disagreements, but they all agree on one point. We must overthrow Assad. There is one split, which is a small camp, let's say about 20% of the opposition, which rejects all form of international intervention, whereas 80% of the opposition is actually calling for the international community to intervene. The international community has so far failed them, and this is brewing more and more frustration, and what we're seeing is these other forms of division.
But on that point, if you're calling for international support, after the international community's experience of what we've seen in, for example, Libya and Egypt, is it not a legitimate question to ask that if Assad goes, who's behind door number 2?
Well, it's only normal that once Assad leaves, a form of chaos will actually prevail. That's normal in no matter what country we look at in the world. Nobody expects to have utopia immediately after the toppling of a dictatorship. It's going to take years to rebuild the country because it took 40 years for Assad and his family to destroy it. Now, the key question over here is, let the people of Syria decide who's going to run the country after that. We have to get rid of Assad. We go to the polls, and the people of Syria will decide who runs the country. If the people of Syria decide to vote for a man with a big beard, let it be so. They have chosen it. If the people of Syria decide to go for a secular government, let it be so. That's what they have decided. We have the responsibility to protect the civilians. We can't say we are not going to intervene because we don't know what government is going to rule the country, when what we have in the present is a government that is killing its own people.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm James Reinl, and we're taking a look at the ongoing bloodshed in Syria. I'm joined by Yossi Meckelberg from the think tank Chatham House and Regent's College, James Denslow, a blogger and commentator on the Middle East, Abdul Wahab Omar, the Syrian opposition activist, and Victor Mizin from the Moscow State Institute of International Relations. James, I'd like to turn to you now. We're running out of time, but maybe I can get your comments on what Abdul Wahab Omar was just saying. He says that with Assad, the only language he understands is force, and it's up for the international community to agree and use that force.
Well, clearly the international community is not upholding its responsibility to protect in the case of the huge number of civilians that have died in Syria. However, I would say that the international community does not have a single position on things like the opposition or further sanction or potential action on Syria. Clearly there is divisions, and there is the Americans and the Europeans who are looking to create the Friends of Syria and trying to unite the opposition and create a process of transition by which the silent majority of Syrians can somehow feel confidence in. And then you have the Russians and the Chinese blocking any sort of form of real sanction at a multilateral platform level like the United Nations. Now, I think that's actually a convenient truth for the Western powers, who have no economic or political appetite for any form of large-scale intervention in the Middle East right now. However, the Russians themselves have got to ask what's in their own interest. The further this conflict goes on, the more the state deteriorates, the more likely it is that when the Assad regime does fall, if it is to go that way, you'll have a situation that is more like Iraq, as we discussed earlier. However, the Russians do have significant interest there. They are arguably the closest larger power beyond perhaps Iran to the regime. And it's almost like that quote from the Leopard, for things to stay the same, everything must change. And I think the Russians should be thinking in a far more imaginative manner towards affecting the behaviour of the regime, because the ceasefire is only a ceasefire in name. Clearly 300 monitors cannot put a significant break on violence in the country. And instead, I think the quote of first-class tickets of a death show is a very good one, a very powerful one. And the fact that the monitors themselves are in danger of bombings and shootings, it only takes one serious incident and they're out of there. So the Annan game is the best game in town, but is clearly not enough for the people of Syria.
Maybe I'll throw that one over to you for a last comment, Victor Mizin in Moscow. Is that fair, what James says? Russia has been blocking action through the UN Security Council, but the question is a failed Syrian state in Russia's best interests?
Well, I think that Russia is understanding that probably, as I said, Assad days are counted. And as it is portrayed in national media, it's like Assad's legitimate regime is being attacked by some thugs, some militants, supported by some nasty outside forces. But I think what was said here, this level of bloodshed, which is completely unacceptable in 21st century. I'm not naive, but what we need, it's not fact-fighting mission. We need peacekeepers now. UN peacekeepers, I don't know, NATO peacekeepers in the country, because this terrible situation must be stopped. And I think that lesson, once again, should be taught to all dictators. And that's why, of course, we must be flexible, but we've seen how all efforts for international solutions, they basically have been scuttled. And I think it will be the fate of Annan's plan, which is not being effectuated at full strength. So we need to do something and to prevent the, I hope, innocent people just being slaughtered.
Yossi, I'll throw that over to you for a final comment. Have all international solutions been scuttled?
Well, we need to go back to the drawing board and to look at this involvement. Some people don't want a repeat of Libya, but at the end of the day, it's not about peacekeeping, because there is no peace to keep. There is a need to support the opposition. The Assad regime is completely been delegitimized in this process. This is a regime that killed thousands and thousands of its own people. Now, the problem with the international community, they want a guarantee what will be the day after. No revolution in history, there was a guarantee what will happen in the day after. It's actually a discourse. There will be ongoing discussions with whoever will take over. Even the Syrians don't know what they want the day after. What kept the Assad regime right now in power is the division among the opposition, which are natural because of the nature of the society, and the division in the international community. What both needs to be actually single-minded about is about getting rid of the Assad regime and try to rebuild Syria in favor and in the interest of the Syrian people. And that's the way forward.
That was Yossi Meckelberg from the think tank Chatham House and Regent's College saying that nobody knows what is going to happen the day after the revolution. I was also joined by James Denslow, a blogger and commentator on the Middle East. Over the line from Birmingham in the UK by Abdul Wahab Omar, the Syrian opposition activist. And also over the line, but from Russia, by Victor Mizin from the Moscow State Institute of International Relations. You're listening to the Voice of Russia in London. I'm James Reinl. Stay tuned for the latest update on what's making headlines around the world.
Positive result.
Okay, and James?
I think there's increasingly sectarian elements to it, but I would still describe it as an opposition to the regime that's very diverse in its makeup.
Okay, and Abdul Wahab Omar?
I believe there are two sects in this conflict. The one is the sect that has a degree of conscience. On the other side, the sect that has lost all conscience whatsoever. Yet the regime is playing along those religious lines.
And Victor, over the line to Russia.
Yes, I think it's quite the case, and contrary to what many Russian conspiracy theorists are thinking, that that United States had instigated Arab Spring. I think that it was completely unexpected process, and now it only enhances the positions, the foothold of all extremists, marginals and terrorists like al-Qaeda. But unfortunately, I think that Assad regime is doomed because
You're listening to the Voice of Russia in London. I'm James Reinl, and we're taking a look at the ongoing bloodshed in Syria. After almost 16 months of increasingly violent opposition to President Bashar al-Assad, and the Syria crisis becomes ever more worrying. Events in recent days suggest the tensions there are developing an increasingly sectarian dimension. Reports suggest Sunni Muslims are travelling from Tunisia, Algeria and Kosovo to join their brethren in Syria. An obscure Islamist group, Jabhat al-Nusra li-Akhalash, or foreign intervention, gets stronger as the bloodshed gets worse. To probe these questions, we're hosting a discussion in our London studio. I'm joined by Yossi from the think tank Chatham House and Regent's College, James Denslow, a blogger and commentator on the Middle East, Abdul Wahab Omar, the Syrian opposition activist, and Victor Mizin from the Moscow State Institute of International Relations, over the line from Russia. Okay, to get the ball rolling, I'd like to get a single sentence answer from each of you to the following question. First of all, to you, Yossi, is the Syria crisis evolving from a political to a sectarian conflict?
In a single sentence, I think from the beginning there was an element of sectarianism in this conflict. It just got worse because it couldn't achieve any.
I am probably naive messianic thinker, but I think that democracy will sooner or later prevail worldwide.
Maybe I'll turn back to you, Yossi, at this stage. You said that it was sectarian to begin with and that it's getting worse. Can you maybe present an analysis of what we've seen over the last few days? For example, the bomb attacks in Damascus that left 55 people dead and almost 400 wounded. Is there any link in your mind between what happened there and al-Qaeda?
I think there might be. And al-Qaeda is kind of an abstract and amorphic definition. It's not an organization with a chain of command. Just if you look at the letters allegedly were left by bin Laden, it's more an ideas and more way to operate than in a chain of command that tells certain people what to do.
Jam claims responsibility for massive suicide bombings in Damascus, prompting fears of al-Qaeda involvement. Sectarian clashes between Sunnis and Alawites, the president's powerful minority clan, are spilling across the border into Lebanon. What initially looked like a secular movement against Assad's rule could be evolving into a region-wide jihad between rival religious factions. Meanwhile, Assad shows no sign of backing down, and the opposition Syrian National Council remains deeply divided. So, is Syria in danger of becoming like Iraq in the dark days of the al-Qaeda insurgency? Is there any hope left in the peace plan and monitoring of the international envoy Kofi Annan? And does the argument for